And when you look at a factor that strengthens a community, reduces fear, increases trust, reduces isolation, increases engagement, it's not churches, it's not sports teams, sorry Celtics, it's not, all the factors you'd look at, it's not schools. I'm not saying they all don't play a role, but what was the most powerful agent in every study? It was pets. Because two strangers walking down the street with no dogs typically look the other way. It's an awkward hello. Two strangers walking with the dogs stop. There's a 10-minute conversation. They don't have sleepovers. They don't now go to dinner the next night together. And they don't talk about wealth, what kind of car you drive, where you went to college, any of that. They basically say, what's her name? What's she like to eat? Where'd you get her? I mean, in other words, they become this sort of commonizing agent, this sort of democratizing small d across the culture. And so it's, I make the case that the cheapest medicine for this country, which right now could use some, is pets.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum. Today we're continuing our transformation series, looking at the ways in which COVID has acted as an agent of change in our lives. The subject of today's forum is relationship rollercoaster, and we can all attest to how the pandemic impacted our personal lives and interactions. People found themselves in lockdown with a unique array of people, partners, kids, roommates, and casual acquaintances. The stress and insecurity of this domestic experiment turned up the heat on all sorts of relationships. Some people witnessed the death of friends or family. Others were deprived of seeing neighbors or colleagues, and kids missed school friends and teammates. We all lost the support of community groups like choirs. As we slowly emerge from our COVID cocoons, a significant number of relationships have cemented or ended. Meanwhile, millions of Americans have become the proud owners of pandemic puppies. To help consider the various aspects of this question, we have three wonderful guests to join us today. Rich Slatcher is a professor of psychology at the University of Georgia, where his research focuses on understanding how people's close relationships affect their health and well-being. Andrés Holderis is executive director of Boston Children's Chorus, which harnesses the power of music to cultivate empathy, while connecting kids from the city's many diverse neighborhoods. BCC works with nearly 500 children annually, focusing on music as a catalyst for change. Mark Cushing is founder and CEO of the Animal Policy Group and author of Pet Nation, an inside look at how pets have captured the hearts and homes of American families, creating a national cultural transformation. Well, welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us today. So today we're going to look at some of the emotional bases of our relationships, which all took some kind of a hit during 2020. And we're going to start with you, Rich. Hello.
Hello.
You've been overseeing a project, a global project, which is looking at love in a time of COVID. That's a clever title, stolen. Assessing the pandemic's impact on people's love lives. So maybe it's a little too early to say anything definitive, but did people generally stick together throughout this ordeal? And was it because of the lack of better options, or was it fear of the unknown?
So, well, first of all, Mary, thank you for convening this panel. I'm delighted to be a part of it. We have, in this large study that has about 5,000 people that have participated in it, we've found that people in relationships have generally divided up pretty well into haves and have-nots, what we call them. So those people who were in relationships that were doing pretty well going into the pandemic seemed to get even stronger across the pandemic as they had more time together. They were, in many cases, their main or sole companion throughout this. For those couples who were not doing as well at the beginning of the pandemic, they have really struggled. So relationship scientists have determined that two big things that determine whether or not couples break up and stay together are, one, the obvious one, how happy they are in their relationship, and two, how committed they are. So whether or not couples split up really depends upon those two big things. So the sort of happiness part is what I already talked about. But then the other thing is commitment. So, if we see that people are in a long-term relationship, even if they're struggling in the pandemic, we actually don't see that many divorces because people are unlikely to leave a relationship when, first of all, there are economic concerns going on and lots of uncertainty in the world. For those people that were in shorter term relationships, not that committed and not that happy, those broke up pretty quickly, or so the data indicate.
But surely some of the stresses that came into play here were unprecedented. I mean, many people's relationships work because they work shifts, they see each other some of the time, and they have different duties. And all of a sudden that collapsed. So introverts and extroverts suddenly had new stressors. So did it not put unprecedented tests on people's relationships?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we know that stress is one of the biggest contributors to relationship dissatisfaction and to breakups. If you have a friend who's getting divorced and you ask them why they got divorced, almost no one would say because of the stress in our lives. But the reality is that is an insidious factor that plays a huge role in relationship problems. Insidious because we often don't know about it. We have it going on in the background, but it can really lead to relationship problems. So the pandemic has obviously been a huge stressor for people, more so for different kinds of people. So people who are parents of young children, for example, under tremendous amounts of stress. People who have lost their jobs or had reduced work hours because of the pandemic. Major stressors. So all of those we would expect to be having more relationship stress as usual. One of the questions that we asked, so early on in the pandemic, talking about introversion and extroversion, we saw these kind of memes on Twitter where people would say things like, take care of your extroverted friends because they're really suffering right now. They're home by themselves. So as a psychologist, what I know is that extroverts generally do better than introverts in just their mood and how they're doing in general, not just because of their sociability, but because people who are extroverted tend to also be higher in what we call positive affect and sort of emotions related to happiness. So we were able to put this idea to the test. We asked all the 5,000 people in our study how introverted or extroverted they were at the very beginning of the study, and then we followed them over time. And what we saw was that at every time point for the first several months of the study, and I would expect beyond when we start looking at that data, the extroverts were happier than introverts. They were sleeping better than introverts. They, on pretty much any measure of well-being, low levels of depression, greater satisfaction in life, they were doing better than introverts were. And in fact, everyone, so the good news is that whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, if you look at the very beginning of the pandemic, at the end of March here in the United States, people increased from there. That was sort of a low point for many people because of the uncertainty and the stress involved in what's going to happen with this pandemic. But extroverts especially increased at a faster rate back to higher levels of happiness, lower levels of depression. So we do see that these stressors do impact people differentially depending upon what's going on in the relationship and what their personalities are like.
Interesting. I think culturally it might be interesting too. Certain cultures probably fare better than others. If you're used to having your family living with you all the time around the clock, it's not such a big shift to be in lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're fortunate to have, we've had the survey translated into 10 different languages. And so we do hope to look at, as we get past kind of the more obvious questions that we want to ask, trying to identify cultural differences, which of course impact just how you approach life, but also there were huge differences between communities in terms of their COVID restrictions and so forth.
Mm. So you said at one point that Zoom was a social band-aid, which I thought was actually quite a fun expression. I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that, but I think people that were alone during COVID were particularly vulnerable and, super isolated. Yet despite this, online dating saw an uptick. Bumble said there were 12 million users around the world last September. So were people just texting and nothing more? Or what was this social band-aid that you're referring to?
Yeah, so let's talk about the sort of band-aid first, and then the kind of what are people doing with dating also. Yeah, studying Zoom has been fascinating during the pandemic. You know, if you'd asked me in March when we started knowing that this pandemic was going to last for a while, that Zoom would be the thing, one of the big things I'd be focusing on, I would have said, you're crazy. But it has been something we've really looked at along the way. We've looked at how people use Zoom. Do they use it with, just one other person, with a group of people like we're doing here, friends versus family? And so we found a couple of different things. It's a social band-aid in that it doesn't replace what we have lost from in-person relationships, but it helps us to get past this difficult time point in our lives. We know that people who use Zoom one-on-one, that most closely approximates an in-person interaction. So if I'm talking to my mom or a close friend, it's not so different from one-on-one. Of course, it's different and it's better to be in person. But when we start seeing the bigger differences is when you start getting a larger group, where people have to have sort of artificial turn taking. It's harder to jump in without really interrupting the flow of things. And so with that, we see people far prefer in-person interactions. And we see, coming back to introversion, extroversion, one of the more interesting and I think perhaps surprising findings is that extroverts especially loathe the large Zoom calls. You would think they would be the ones that like it the most, but in fact, when we look at how much extroverts like large Zoom calls compared to large in-person interactions, how fatigued they are after these interactions, they look like introverts. When we look at like one-on-one interactions, the extroverts really like them on Zoom much more than the introverts. But when I ask introverts and extroverts how much they like these big Zoom calls, the extroverts look like introverts. I think that's because extroverts like to be heard. They like to be responded to. So you're really restricting their social movement, so to speak, when you're using Zoom with a large Zoom happy hour or something like that. So dating, you talked about how there's been an uptick in online dating. So that's true. There was about a 15% increase in online dating in the second half of 2020. However, what that masks is a much lower level overall of dating. Okay, so of our sample, only 20% of those who were single expressed any interest whatsoever in online dating. That leaves 80% of people who were not interested. The majority of those people did not date at all. We had a lot of open-ended questions that we would ask in addition to kind of so-called quantitative data that we collected. And we would ask people to just share what their experiences were like with online dating. They didn't like the video chat aspect, especially early in a potentially blossoming relationship. So they stuck mostly to messaging. And what we heard from many people, at least in the first half of the pandemic, which is what we know the most about at this point, people were really diving into their close personal relationships that already existed. They were talking to their parents more on Zoom or in person if they were around. They were forming pods of close friends or parents of their kids' friends that they would hang out with in small groups. And so what we see is kind of a pruning of social relationships and people going in more in depth into those ones that they're close with, not so much really focusing on dating. We do see this uptick in online dating, and people used it in interesting ways. What we found is that people used it for more casual encounters, for needs that could not be satisfied by friends and family, but not so much interested in really starting a new big relationship. Most people seem to be kind of mentally putting that off for a while.
So moving away from intimates or close relationships, a lot of people get their fix from work, and they take some of the pressure off the expectation of that intimate relationship if you're getting some of your buzz from other places. So some people were deprived of that. So if you were able to split your time or your space, so you had a workspace, which was not the case for a lot of people, was that better for the psyche, for the emotional? Have we got any idea if that was better? People fared better if they were able to separate somehow?
So we know that spending time with our intimate others leads to more time, leads to greater emotional intimacy. We also know that novelty is what's important in sexual interest and intimacy. So I'm going to circle back to your point in a second. When you're spending time with your romantic partner all the time, we lose a lot of that novelty that we see typically in relationships. And so when you're not, when you're going off to an office or wherever you work outside the home, if you do, and you come home, your relationship is slightly more novel because you've been away from your partner for 8 or more hours, right? And so part of it is, yes, you're relying on your romantic partner more, but also you are losing something in not being around other people, not being around coworkers. We've lost water cooler talk, even though we are able to communicate like we're doing now via Zoom. You can't have these little casual, random side conversations, can you, on Zoom? There's been some interesting new work on what we call emotion ships, where certain people really rely on different people in their lives for different emotional needs. For this one person, it's sort of casual, fun stuff that we do together. For this other person, it's really, this is the person I talk to when I have problems. I would imagine for those kinds of people, the loss, who really rely on these different kinds of relationships, the loss of work relationships would be especially difficult.
So, moving over now to the group dynamic. So first we've got people that were lucky that were in relationship. We've got people living on their own. And then we've got people that missed out on their community interactions, which, we all do to lesser or greater degrees. You mentioned about your son's scout group being hit. So Andrés, you run the Boston Children's Chorus, welcome. And that serves a great function in the city for 500 kids. So we see a quick clip, if we might, of your wonderful kids singing for us.
Which direction should I go? I'm so tired and so worn. I won't stop until I'm safe and strong.
Where I'm running to is running through my mind. Always on the run, am I running out of time? Darkness in my way, I pray the sun will shine. Started from the bottom and that was underlined by the place that I'm from. Sometime is undivine. I hear the songs of freedom and they're running through my mind. Close my eyes, imagine a place next to me where I no longer can be labeled a refugee. Destiny, cause somewhere down these dark roads we lost the tribe, but we found our souls. Cold rain, all pain.
So, nice performance there. So this group provides a lot of emotional support for kids and social interaction. So how did you survive the last sort of year? How did you keep your kids singing?
Well, I'm very happy to be here and be having this conversation. It was a significant challenge for us. I think Boston Children's Chorus started the year in a very different way than the year ended. What you saw there is one of our virtual choirs. You saw, people in our building with that brick background. That concert had, which our last concert of the year had 5 music videos that we recorded outdoors and in person. But that was, March, April, May, when we started the year. We still were very fearful, there was a lot that we didn't know. We were able to leverage technology, the Band-Aid that Rich was referring to, in getting a Zoom setup that allowed us to deliver synchronous instruction, vocal instruction from a conductor, and from an accompanist, but that was about all that could be heard. So we had, you know, the way I explained the system we built in our space was, when you go to your favorite Broadway musical, if you have a really large instrument, say the timpani or a massive stand-up bass or a tuba, if it doesn't fit in the orchestra pit of this very old theater built in the early 1900s, chances are that instrument could be up 10 floors, over 5 buildings, you take your pick. Those instruments are always connected and piped into the theater via speakers. It's just analog cables running through the building that bring them into the building. If you change those speakers and put Zoom, that's essentially what we did. We had a conductor in one room behind closed doors with clean air. We had an accompanist in another room with clean air. And that's what we did for all of our instructional delivery for the first 4 months of the academic year, September through December. At that point, we realized that this wasn't going to last and kind of keep the instructional level high and keep singers engaged. That was really difficult to actually make music that way. The first few months, there was a lot of take your cell phone and record yourself singing your part alone in your bedroom. That is not choral music making. So we expanded that system where we had essentially 6 individual rooms in the building, plus the conductor and the accompanist that existed, all wired to be able to have music making synchronously with everyone in separate rooms with their own air sanitation. So we leaned heavily into technology. We hoped to launch this in January, but if we remember, that's when cases were at an all-time high. So we conducted very, very small limited tests really at the end of February and welcomed singers into the building in the month of March and April to record and actually hear each other live. When you're in the building, just the proximity of knowing that your classmate is just behind a wall and you can talk to them via a microphone and see them on camera, just that proximity of being in the building together really transformed the relationships that the singers have with each other. Outside of that, we were limited by the weather. We tried to do a lot of work outdoors. We did 3 outdoor rehearsals in the fall and a lot more in the spring once the weather got warmer. But if it rained, we had to cancel it. We had one rehearsal, I remember, it was supposed to be a nice day. It was a Saturday. It started raining. Temperature dropped to about 40s. You have an accompanist outside trying to play the piano. That is not a pretty sight when someone's standing over the accompanist with an umbrella and their fingers start shaking. So we had to be really inventive, but technology and trying the best to do our work outdoors.
So pivoting away now from the technological challenges, which were huge, what are the other things that they get from being in a chorus? I mean, they've got routine, they've got discipline, there's an emotional need that's being met, there's interaction, sense of worth. So how did you, people are very needy, particularly children, as social animals. How do you think they managed with all that? I mean, some of them are very reliant, I imagine, on you for that outlet.
Yeah, the work that Boston Children's Chorus does is it's an integrated mission where we focus on excellent musical instruction, but at the same time, we're having conversations surrounding identity, social justice, social change, really conversations that are on the minds of our singers. One of the things that I heard often when I came on board at BCC last July was BCC is the only space where I can talk about things that I cannot talk about in school, right? And you have friendships forming from very different parts of our city or region in spaces that BCC curates very carefully. So the loss for us was huge. It was, an intimate space for us to process what is happening in the world. All of a sudden became, we have to have these very difficult conversations from far away. I mean, last summer was traumatic for many people in this country, and we've seen hate, vitriol in so many directions spewed. And BCC would have normally been a safe cocoon for those conversations to be had. Some of them were still had over Zoom. There were some very delicate and intimate conversations happening on Zoom, but it's not the same as being next to your peer, offering them a tissue if they're expressing something that is really difficult, and keeping the conversation intimate. And the barriers that the technology has were significant for us.
What about the actual membership? Did you find that actually it was a boom that people wanted to sing, or was that just?
It was interesting. I mean, we faced a lot of attrition in the lower levels of the chorus for obvious reasons. It's much easier for a teenager to sit in front of a computer after going to school for a long day and then do their after school program on Zoom in front of a screen. For the younger kids, that's where we experience the most loss. But I was a little confused about our ability to attract. We attracted about 82 new singers into Boston Children's Chorus during the pandemic. Everyone knew it was going to be virtual. Everyone knew it was going to be over Zoom. I did not expected new inflows, and to be 20 people away from 100 was a little confusing. And I think that speaks more to the power of our music, less to the power of our music making and more to the power of the connections and the bonds that are formed at Boston Children's Chorus, where that's really the impact of our work, where the work that we do around identity and social change and the conversations that young singers are able to have at BCC, they speak for themselves.
So you've talked about relationship building, which is really key to all of these activities, particularly for kids, because a lot of them weren't going to school. So I guess the COVID gave us time to reconsider the value of certain relationships in our life and maybe a new respect for life itself and the brevity of it. So Rich, going back to you for 1 second, would you say that we are more likely to seek more meaningful or purposeful relationships post-COVID?
It's an interesting question. And I'm going to flip the answer on its head a little bit, because I think what people have actually gotten some of those deep relationships over the pandemic. As I was saying earlier, people have really kind of pruned their social networks and really focused on their deeper social relationships with close friends and family. But what we've really missed out on are those casual kinds of interactions. We've missed out on going to happy hours, real happy hours, not Zoom ones. We've missed going out to parties. We've missed having dinners out, group dinners, with several friends. So I think that people are really going to start to reappreciate that. I think, people have appreciated their close relationships during the pandemic, but I think what we've really missed out on are these casual interactions. There's been some really interesting research done in psychology that shows when you have more casual interactions during the day with strangers, like let's say you live in New York and you're taking the subway and you have some casual chats with people on the train, people are happier after they do that. It's a mood booster. And we've been totally lacking in those kinds of random interactions with strangers. And when they've happened, we've had our literal masks on. So I think that's really going to change.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading some research about this third zone that we all crave, which is the zone between work and home. As these things you're saying, the barista that we talk to in the morning, the barber when you go to the barber shop, these things that augment our lives, and we didn't even put a value on them before, but of course they're terribly valuable, and we took them for granted.
Totally.
So talking about taking things for granted, well, people that were really stuck for emotional support and interaction and love turned to something the third guest we have today knows a great deal about. Mark Cushing is author of Pet Nation, The Love Affair That Changed America, and he knows all about our purposeful relationships with pets. So data shows that 11 million people became new pet owners during the pandemic. So there are certainly benefits attached to pet ownership, and we know some of them: companionship, emotional support, sense of security, just being three of them. So Mark, welcome. In a time of great uncertainty, do you think that pets might offer us a more reliable presence than humans?
Well, pets offer it in times of great uncertainty or times of acute certainty. The truth is, pets haven't changed. Cats chase string, dogs chase balls. But what we've seen is this transformation of the relationship of pets in American culture and families and American communities. And then COVID put that on steroids. And you had this phenomenon of, and by the way, we're now close to 70% of American households that have pets. So it's not as if a handful did before and then everybody got the memo and went out and acquired a pet if they could find one, which was not easy. But you know, that what's really happened, and I know Rich understands as well as an academician, the human-animal bond has been not just discovered and affirmed in academic studies, but it's been experienced on a wide scale basis across the country, rural, suburb, urban, it doesn't matter. And with an engagement with pets, Mary, your oxytocin level goes up and your cortisol level goes down. It makes you happier, period. You feel better, and people pick that up. And when we brought pets inside, you know, I'm a baby boomer, when, you know, pets were kind of accessories. They were outside, they came in some of the time, and so forth. There were exceptions to that, but generally that was the case. When they came inside and people began to experience dogs and cats, it's not just pandemic puppies, on a daily, regular basis, they kind of got the news that this was something special. And so what happened in COVID was it gave a lot of people an excuse. Hell, I'm going to be home. My partner, my wife or husband are going to be home. Our kids are going to be home. Wouldn't this be a great time? And pretty good idea, actually, to have a puppy. You also had people that worked in workplaces that were pet friendly. And this is a great study done by Carrie O'Hara, that people that work for companies that are pet friendly and allow you to bring pets into the workplace, who don't own pets, like their company better. They like their boss better. They're more likely to stay with the company better. You know, pets just sort of pick up the energy of a place. And I'm sure Andres knows with the kids in the Boston chorus. But what's interesting is when people say, well, have pets become the new children? I say that's an insult to pets. They have a lot better deal than children do. I mean, you know, we treat our pets now, you know, in a royal fashion. Cats have always looked at humans as staff, but even dogs now, you know, kind of rule the world in a way that kids never could. And pets don't have a teenage phase. Now, I have 5 children, and, you know, and I love my daughters. 4 of them are daughters, but, you know, there was about a 3-year period where, you know, not so much fun, you know, but pets don't have that phase. You know, they show up every day. So in a pandemic, no matter how you're feeling, just the ability to, you know, if your cat just crawls across your back of your neck as you're reading something, an email or whatever it might be, or your dog who wants to continually play, you know, good things happen and people figure that out. And it's very powerful. And it changed relationships. People saw their partners in a different context. They'd never seen their partner with a pet. In many cases, you hear people surprised that their spouse or partner or children so quickly took to having a pet, and many got a second pet. And that's the other thing occurring, is the New York Times did a great study of the number of new pet owners who said, when and if I go back to my workplace, I've got to get another puppy. I can't leave Sparky home by herself. You know, she's got to have someone to hang with. So it's not done unfolding, but it's been an interesting thing to watch.
So it's definitely a boom. I mean, I've been reading the statistics about pet sales, pet food, animal trainers. I mean, it's through the roof. Yeah. So it's clearly something that is not a fad. I mean, I think the pet ownership thing I'm concerned about a little bit, because not everyone will be able to take their dog to work. I'd love to, but, you know, I mean, there are lots of people who are going to have to try and figure it out, which is going to cause a lot of issues, I think, for people. But what other benefits besides the Oxycontin rush you mentioned?
Oxytocin, just to clarify.
Whoa, careful.
Oxytocin, yeah.
No free drugs.
You get a PhD on your panel, they're gonna point some things out like
Sorry.
that.
Yeah. Well, Andres has also got his under the desk, his dog. So I think he was going to make a little surprise appearance. But anyway,
I'm sure.
So what other things do they do? I mean, I know that they're very good company. They give you a routine. They give you a sense of worth. They love you for no reason.
No, I want to go back to the first point I made about the human-animal bond. There are now 32,000 entries in the Purdue University Veterinary College Animal Welfare Library regarding human-animal bond studies. So what was seen about 50 years ago was kind of folk wisdom. Oh, I know you feel better when your dog's in the room, but that's like your grandmother's soup remedy for flu. I mean, you know, well, there've been study after study. So the most important thing, Mary, that's now the case is that pets have been studied in peer-reviewed studies in academic journals and confirmed to just improve autistic children's engagement with their family. Okay, a sexually abused teenager's dealing with, you know, her emotions and sort of how to ever trust again. Hospitals now, which 30 years ago, if somebody saw a dog in a hospital, they'd run down the hallway and say, "Get that dog out of here." And now find a hospital that doesn't have animal assisted therapy, and you won't find one. New York's a great state, you know, just not too far from you, which had a fierce ban on dogs in hospitals. It was so proud of the fact that you can't bring a dog in now, and dogs are everywhere. My wife chairs anatomy at Mayo Clinic's medical school here in Arizona, and Mayo has canine assisted therapy all over their system. So dogs are now part of therapy. You take seniors who aren't eating well in nursing homes. This is my favorite. And they found by watching fish in an aquarium regularly be fed, and they watched their eating habits, guess what? They went and ate more regular themselves. You have soldiers back from Afghanistan, Iraq, you know, with PTSD, and all the studies there. So it's not just a feel-good thing, you know, it's a do better. And my last piece, and New York's my favorite example, and Boston wouldn't really be any different, is what I call the social capital of pets. And there have been studies in Perth, Australia, San Diego, Portland, where I'm from originally, in Nashville. And when you look at a factor that strengthens a community, reduces fear, increases trust, reduces isolation, increases engagement, it's not churches, it's not sports teams, sorry, Celtics, it's not, you know, all the factors you'd look at, it's not schools. I'm not saying they all don't play a role, but what was the most powerful agent in every study? It was pets, because two strangers walking down the street with no dogs typically look the other way. It's an awkward hello. Two strangers walking with the dogs stop. There's a 10-minute conversation. They don't have sleepovers. They don't now go to dinner the next night together. And they don't talk about wealth, what kind of car you drive, where you went to college, any of that. They basically say, what's her name? What's she like to eat? Where'd you get her? I mean, in other words, they become this sort of commonizing agent, you know, this sort of democratizing small d across the culture. And so it's, you know, I make the case that the cheapest medicine for this country, which right now could use some, is pets. And we still have many places, particularly low-income apartments, that prohibit pets from coming in. And by the way, they're not allowed to legally, but nobody stands up and pushes it. I'm involved in that now. But the point is, the presence of pets, which, you know, they're basically everywhere now. And to some people, that's annoying. The Kimpton hotel chain, you probably all, there's Kimptons everywhere. And they used to be a great client of mine in Portland. They were started on the West Coast. They now have floors that are dedicated to non-pet owners. I laugh every time I say this. I can't imagine 25 years ago, go to floor 3, that's for the non-pet owners. Everywhere
like
else.
Smoking used to be.
Exactly. So we could talk.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here. So obviously you can have too much of a good thing. So although I do think that they are absolutely the emotional currency, because actually both of my kids live on opposite coasts. They've met all their friends through getting dogs. The dog park is the new place where you meet everybody. And in a place where everybody's on their phone, it's the only time they're off their phone actually interacting. So I do think it's a new phenomenon. I just wonder what it says about the American psyche. And I also wonder what it says about our relationship to other people, whether it's easier somehow to have a relationship with a dog. Is it something that's...
Well, I'll defer to Rich, but my comment as, remember, you know, Neon Advisory, I'm a lawyer, so what do I know about anything here? But the truth is, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think your affection for a puppy dilutes or diminishes your ability to have empathy for a human. And in truth, you gave your children as great examples. You can blame yourself, not me, for bringing them up now. But the truth is, pets lead to engagement with people, and that's the social capital factor. So I think pets have taken people that might be shy or, you know, introvert to the extreme, and made them comfortable in engaging with people because it's a safe thing to talk about. And I just have a hard time with the argument. I've heard that argument, and I argue for a living, right, as a lawyer. But I've never been persuaded that it comes close to overcoming the social capital and the positive individual and broader value of learning how to take care of an animal too. Because that's the other thing. Animals humble you. You know, we all know what you have to do with a pet many times during the day. Okay, and it's something that you didn't grow up thinking I was going to do that, and they just make you take care of things in a way that drops you down a peg, and maybe that's a healthy thing.
Less self-obsessed, perhaps. So, Rich, a quick comment from you on that, if you have.
So to Mark's point about sort of substitution, I don't think I think they're adding. I don't think it's a substitution for our in-person relationships. And I'm so glad that you brought up all the great research that's been done on this, Mark. It's making me very excited to look at this aspect of our data. We included, I think, so we have 11 waves of data collection now in our survey. And at wave 3 or 4, we asked about pet ownership to see, did people purchase a new pet? Did they already have a pet? But regardless, if they had a cat or a dog or multiple things. And so we haven't looked at that data yet. And now I'm really eager to look at it to see, we can test some of these questions. Did it add to people's relationships? I don't think it substituted them. And I think it acted probably, and I think you got at this with you're talking about how it raises oxytocin, lowers cortisol levels. I think it really has buffered people's stress. But it could be that it's just what we call in statistics a main effect, meaning it's a net total positive, regardless of what's going on with stressors in your life. It's just a great thing. And I know from personal experience, we've got a couple of part Maine Coon cats at home. Those are huge cats. It's kind of false advertising because they're a mix. So I expected them to grow to these huge things, and they're actually just normal cat size, but they have all the other features of a Maine Coon. And my wife and I especially have appreciated them so much in this pandemic. Really, yeah.
Well,
I think we're closer than ever, the cats and us.
Here's the challenge now, and if you'll let me, Mary, I'll just throw this out there. For all the reasons we've been discussing, the problem now, and I'm in the middle of this very much professionally, is we have an acute shortage of dogs. Who would have thought that 5 years ago, watching ads late at night, of singers decrying the condition in shelters. Now shelters are pretty much empty, and we have an acute shortage of veterinarians and veterinary technicians and nurses. So the system of taking care of pets was not prepared for this. I can just tell you that. So I spend most of my day now addressing the shortage, reminding people it's a good thing. So we better figure out an answer.
We've just got some questions. Sorry to shift here, but Shannon has said, a surprising pandemic era revelation. For me, as a choral singer, I was part of a virtual choir recording clips on our own, which we eventually mixed into the whole. I found it unexpectedly difficult and at times unenjoyable to sing on my own. I had no idea how much energy and joy I was deriving from the other members of the group, especially as I'm deeply introverted. So,
that was really fascinating. I mean, I'll let Andrés jump in, but I was really fascinated by the introverted comment, obviously, since we were talking about that. But yeah. I think people like Shannon, who are really, really introverted, have realized how much they actually like relationships and like people, that it's really important, even if it can be stressful to go to a party and you might get a little bit socially anxious. I think that's pretty typical of what we've seen in our study. People, introverts and extroverts, have really deeply missed those kinds of social interactions. So Andrés, jump in.
I'll speak for Chico, who is, showing up here on the call just to represent for all the pets. But I mean, anecdotally, we had the same experience with our singers. Just, at the beginning, it was super exciting to see yourself in a virtual concert and all the boxes zooming around. And at the end of it, it was really a drag where we saw engagement just really dramatically shift. After you do 5 of these things, you're singing your one line, you're not getting the singing in harmony. I sing a C and you sing an E, and we both are, oh my God, we just made a chord. This is so powerful. That doesn't exist in the virtual choir. You're just singing your note and your line and forget about it. You're in your room, hype yourself up for a performance on camera. So that was a really, really big challenge for us. And it really became a challenge to really try to understand what is choral singing without the in-person interaction. That's why we had to go outside.
Also, the actual physical energy, it's so hard to measure that. There's a physical buzz you get from singing in a choir that I don't know how you'd even monitor it, but the sum is greater than the individual parts. I'm singing to the choir here, telling you this.
And are you back in person now, Andres? Are you? And
We're not. So we're fortunate that individuals ages 12 and above can get vaccinated. We're hopeful that that age range will expand. BCC works with children ages 7 to 18. So we did a goodbye event for our seniors, but we still had a virtual concert on May 29th. We'll see how it goes for us to be fully in person in the fall. We are hopeful that we can, but we just have to monitor all the federal and state guidelines. We are going to be, we actually just announced earlier today an initiative called We Sing, where we're going to be singing in public parks with members of the choir, and it's not a performance. It's supposed to be you and you coming together, and we're going to learn some easy songs and sing outside together, because the joy that we derive from singing in a parking lot, which is not a super sexy thing, we just felt like we were $1 million just getting together and making music and hearing harmony. So we want to share that with folks who might have an hour or two to spare in public parks. So we'll be doing that July and August in many parks around the Boston area.
We've got a couple of different questions here. I don't know who wants to field them. Two. One woman's talking about age and how is it easier, is it easier for healthy, independent people over 80 years dealing with lockdown? And somebody else said, I'm curious about why loose community ties are so important to me. Only being able to see my biological family and 1 or 2 friends felt catastrophic. So anybody got anything to say about that?
I mean, that's exactly, I think that kind of gets to your question and the point that I made about missing out on those casual conversations. I think, and it's something that, I'm a social psychologist. This is what I'm supposed to be an expert in. But the vast majority of us who study this stuff have studied our closest relationships, almost ignoring these kinds of casual interactions. And it's really gotten me rethinking the nature of relationships and how important these casual interactions are. And it's really interesting to hear this from just the first couple of questions that we've gotten from the listeners, that they feel the same way.
Somebody else has said, I feel individuals have been a lot more empathetic and emotionally available during the lockdown. However, in most areas where lockdowns have eased, individuals have shifted back to their old ways of being. So I believe for most individuals, especially extroverts, it will be more of a conscious choice to appreciate the things that they haven't appreciated before and make active lifestyle changes.
I just came back from a conference late last evening in Orlando, the first one in the veterinary animal health space in 15 months. 6,000-7,000 people came. It's normally an 18,000 person conference, but it was interesting. My sense would be different than that question, because I think it's humbled everybody in a good way. And I found extroverts. I hosted a dinner, and we had a long conversation at a dinner group of 12 about the kind of permanence of changes. And there was a sense in every case, and it wasn't friends needing to impress friends. I think people had enough wine and spirits that they were being pretty upfront about it. And my sense was people were going to be more conscious of things that they hadn't been. They were taking the time to not smell the roses, that trite phrase, but there was a sense that coming out of this, they weren't going backward. Everybody agreed, I'm not going back to life in December of 2019. That's not my model that I'm racing to replicate at all. So I would just anecdotally throw that out. There's no science to it, but it was interesting.
It's a great question that I think about all the time. What's going to happen as we come out of the pandemic? People have talked about a possible roaring 20s, a roaring 2020s, as we come out of this. And I can see it from both perspectives. I completely see your perspective, Mark, and I also see Shane, who asked the question, their perspective. Because I know as humans, we habituate to things. We habituated to wearing masks. We're starting to habituate, most of us, to not wearing masks now that we're getting vaccinated. But it may spark some relatively long-term change, and the question is how will we see that coming out, right? Like in the roaring 20s, you saw, in the roaring 1920s, you saw flappers and new, really kind of exuberant societal things going on. So will we see that in music, kind of more optimistic music, in other kinds of cultural things that we maybe can't even envision right now? Those are the kinds of things that I'm going to be on the lookout for, to see if our joy and excitement and changes in the way that we've been thinking about things, if that's somewhat fleeting or if it's more longer term than that.
Well, you're actually queuing up the next program that we're doing, which is about has pandemic been a force of good? We're looking at all the innovation and new ideas and pivots that we had to make in science, in art, in vaccine production, all the things that were overnight had to ratchet up the game. And some of them were very positive for us, if we stick with them, as you say, if we don't go back to our old ways. So I'm going to ask you a personal question now. You don't have to answer that if you don't want, but I was interested in each of you thinking about, from your own personal perspectives, which of your relationships were impacted most by COVID? I don't know if you've even thought about that, but I know I miss singing in a choir, and my kids are on opposite coasts, so that was tough. So I know that was the hardest thing for me. But I mean, you mentioned your kids, your teenagers, your boys, I think, and scouting, Rich.
Yeah.
You said they were.
Yeah, one of my teenage sons is into scouting, and that's been really hard because they haven't had trips. That they did do a couple of socially distanced things where they slept in separate tents, and we went out and camped for a weekend. And it worked. I mean, it was definitely better than not doing that, but it was really hard to keep the younger kids engaged doing Zoom. Scouts starts at age 11 or 12, and keeping everyone engaged. So yeah, that's been a real challenge. And I think the broader point about what's being missed is we've missed out on these kinds of civic activities, going to church, community organizations, chorus, these things that are the fabric for society. There's a book that some of you may be familiar with by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. And it talks about some of the disintegration of these things like Lions Club and bowling leagues and things like that. And I wonder if maybe we'll see a just slight reversal maybe of that trend after as we come out of the pandemic, and a greater appreciation for these kinds of group societies that bond us together. I hope so.
Yeah.
I had one change, just one that was many perhaps, but one I'd highlight. My group, I have 9 people that are part of the animal policy group. We're in 6 states. None of us live near each other. And before last March, the end of March, we emailed, we texted, we had conference calls. All right. I decided at the start of the pandemic, we're doing everything on Zoom. If I'm going to call one of you, I'm going to Zoom you. I want to see you. I just want to look at you. You can look at me and talk. Well, I know my team a lot better. And I have a whole set of work colleagues across the country where we now engage much more frequently throughout the year through Zoom, and it's live. Like I'm looking at you right now, Mary, in front of a nice, bookshelf. I see a book behind you and I wonder, what'd you think of that book? So I ended up getting to know a lot of people better, because different than a phone call, And yeah, you can talk for hours on a phone, but you don't typically. I had much more engagement with more people consistently through Zoom that was live and real. And I actually enjoyed it. Like everybody, I got tired of big group Zoom calls. But I just found that to be a positive.
I echo Mark. I think, I moved to the area, to the greater Boston region during the pandemic. My partner and I packed up our apartment in DC. BCC called and said, do you want to do this thing with us? And I said, absolutely, let's do it together. So come July, new city, new apartment, new walk patterns for Chico the dog. And, the loss of proximity with friends in the DC area, very difficult to manage that, particularly during a pandemic. But I have just found that the city of Boston has really just open arms. It's been wonderful to be in conversations. That's how you and I, Mary, found each other, and random Zoom rooms, and you send a private message and say, hey, I've never heard of you or your organization. Would you love to chat? And people have been really willing to do that in a way that I think, had I moved to Boston during non-pandemic times, I don't think I would have, exchanged so many conversations with so many great people.
That's interesting. Did you find any good dog parks?
Multiple. I can't give all the secrets away, but yes, there are. And he's a water dog, so there's a couple that have water access, so we're set.
Oh. Wow, that sounds wonderful.
And I don't think I actually answered that part of the question, Mary, but thinking about it, I think the thing that I miss the most is students. We did a hybrid model this year, but the vast majority of students were online, and those of us that were in person were masked up. You couldn't see. I couldn't tell if I told a joke, if somebody thought it was, you see a little eye crinkle, maybe, and a little head nod like this. But it's hard to get without the feedback that you have. And I can't wait to teach in the fall and to be back in person. And I imagine Andrés feels the same way. And gosh, my heart goes out to you. Moving in a pandemic, we moved to Athens, Georgia, a year before the pandemic, so we had a little time to acclimate. But yeah, I can't wait to get. I think this has laid to rest the idea that we are moving to completely online universities. Certainly, we have more options now to teach, but I think it has shown the importance of in-person social connection when it comes to that, to the classroom.
That's great to hear. Well, we're actually running out of time. I know it's hard to believe, but this was absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed the engagement. I want to thank each of you, Rich, Andrés, Mark, for making time to have this chat with us. We've put a lot of things up so people can see how to contact your organizations if they want to know more about your project. It's on our web page, Rich. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, listening to the Cambridge Forum discussion today about relationship rollercoaster, how COVID impacted our personal lives. We had Rich Slatcher, Professor of Psychology at the University of Georgia, Andrés Holderis, Executive Director of the Boston Children's Chorus, and Mark Cushing, lawyer and author of Pet Nation, an inside look at how pets have become the treasured members of the American family. A very big thank you to Rich, Slatcher, Andrés Holderis, and Mark Cushing. I'll see you all again, I hope, and see the audience again soon. Thanks, everybody.